Hello, all. Welcome back to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel, which you know by now is where we expose grief for what it truly is, which is a natural and healthy way of living and loving. Happy April. We're practically to spring. We're almost there. And with being at the beginning of April, April Fool's Day. So for this month, I want to talk about how grief can fool us into presenting in a way that maybe isn't true to how we actually experience it. So oftentimes I'll hear clients say these things of, there are just so many different things of grief that I didn't know were a thing. I didn't know this was a part of it. Or they'll say, I didn't realize how many areas of my life grief would impact. And so that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about this idea of the ripple effects of grief. Grief can fool us in the fact that it doesn't impact just one area. It impacts multiple. So I want to talk about these ripple effects. Let's jump right into it so we no longer have to be fooled by grief. In grief, we experience two types of losses. So we have that primary loss and the secondary loss or losses. The primary loss is going to be that loss of our loved one. That is the person that we are grieving, that we held a funeral for or not, if that fits within your beliefs. The secondary loss or losses is going to be everything that follows or everything that we are grieving in addition to losing our person, in addition to that primary loss. So take, for example, if we lose a spouse, yes, we are grieving that person. We are also grieving the team member that we had, the financial support that we had, the co-parent that we had if you're parents. We also may be grieving the ability to share the same sense of humor or the ability to have someone to vent to when family things get hard, right? Whatever it might be. These are all the additional things that oftentimes people don't realize come with losing that person. So think about these primary and secondary losses as a rock hitting the water. So that rock is going to signify that primary loss. That is the initial person that we lost. That's the initial impact. From there, what happens? The ripples of the water start, right? So those are all those secondary losses, those things that we are grieving in addition to losing our person. Those secondary losses are all the things that this person brought to our life that we're now also grieving. So I like to use this metaphor not only because it creates a great visual and can really help people understand the concept of primary and secondary losses, but it also helps them really identify what is their primary and secondary losses. Typically, more often than not, we know what our primary is. We know the person we've lost, unless if we're working with an ambiguous or a living loss situation, right? So if we take COVID, for example, we may not know what our primary loss is. So it can be, this visual can be nice to help us identify that, in addition to what are we losing as well that's connected to that initial loss. In talking about grief and educating people on that, I not only want to make sure people know about the concepts such as primary and secondary losses, but I also want people to understand the importance as to why we need to know them, as to why we need to have knowledge around them. When it comes to these primary and secondary losses, it's important to know about them, to not only be able to identify, but to also understand that both losses get the space and should have the space to grieve. We know that when it comes to our primary loss, that loss of our loved one, we're expected to grieve, right? With those secondary losses, with those ripples, with all the impacts that come from that primary loss, oftentimes, one, they're not even seen as a loss. So then two, we don't know that we can grieve them. We don't know that we can create space for them to have a proper grief journey. So that's why it's important to talk about these primary and secondary losses and to talk about the ripple effects of grief, because I want it to be known your secondary losses that appear to be just nothing or just a weird coincidence is not a coincidence. It is directly related to your loss, and it does deserve to be grieved just as much as the loss of your loved one. So with that, let's jump into an exercise. Okay, exercise time. You know, if you've subscribed to the channel or you've seen some of my videos, you know I'm very hands-on and very interactive because that is a great way to learn. So I have an exercise for you. So let's jump into it. So take a look at this. So this is going to represent that rock hitting the water. So the very center, I want you to identify your primary loss, whether that's a loved one that you've lost, a common loss, or it's an ambiguous or a living loss, a loss of a job, anything that might have happened in COVID, retirement, loss of identity. I want you to take a second to identify what is your primary loss. Once you've done that, and this second step will take a little bit of time, so don't feel like you have to rush it. Once you've done that, I want you to identify what are the secondary losses or what are the ripple effects you're experiencing from that initial loss. So this will happen over time. Some may come right away like, oh yes, this for sure. And I've also lost this, or I'm also grieving this. Some of it may come as you experience it and go, whoa, I didn't realize this was going to be part of it. So if you can write this down, if you want this actual visual, you can email me at bsquillis@bestselftherapy.net, and I'm more than happy to send that to you. So you can actually write this down and have the visual for yourself. But the point of the exercise, identify the primary loss, which is the center, which represents that rock, and then identify those secondary losses in the ripples that are on the outside of that rock. Some of that may come right away naturally to you. Others might come as you experience it and go, wow, I didn't realize this is something that I also have to grieve. Okay, so there you have it. We now know what primary and secondary losses are, which cause those ripple effects of grief, which gives us kind of that same effect of a rock hitting the water. We understand why it's important that we know what primary and secondary losses are, and you have a great exercise to really allow you to start exploring what your primary and secondary losses are, which then will allow you to start honoring your grief journey around that and doing the grief work. If you're not familiar with the term grief work or what that means or what that looks like, check out my video from last month that talks all about what I mean by when I say grief work, so you can start doing that journey and start doing that work. Don't forget to subscribe to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel. I've got so many different things coming up. I have an author coming up this month that I'm going to interview that I'm super excited about and cannot wait for you to introduce you all to her and for her to talk a little bit about her book. So I'm excited for that. Stay tuned for that. That'll be coming at the end of April. And then also, if you subscribe, you don't miss any of the other great content that's coming this month or the following month. So be sure to do that. Have an awesome April. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And have a great, happy start to your spring. And we'll see you around.